Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Learning Engineering Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Scotty Craig, and I am joined today by my co-host, Mei or Xiong Li.
Hi. Yes, thanks for joining us today. I'm one of the co-hosts of today. Mei, I'm actually a PhD candidate in human system engineering working with Dr. Scotty Craig at Arizona State University. And currently, I'm also working as a design intern at a University Design Institute at ASU. And then back to you, Scotty.
Thank you, Mei. Today we have Jodi Liz joining us today. And I'm going to let her introduce herself because I'm sure that she can do a much better job introducing herself than I ever could. So take it away, Jodi.
Thank you so much. It's such a privilege and an honor to be here today. Excited to share my experiences and also learn from you from your experiences. I work in the field of international development, implementing digital learning interventions. And these are in countries such as the Gambia and Zambia and Ghana and Bangladesh and several other countries. So all my work is actually done abroad. And I started there over 20 years ago, trying to do all of this work, and lived in Africa for a great number of years. So a lot of the training that I actually have is just being on the ground and really learning and understanding the context about how you would implement a digital learning intervention. When I do these digital learning interventions, I follow a very holistic process. And I did this in the health and the education sector. So it was really interesting for me to learn about how you do trainings and workshops and learning in both of those sectors. Some similarities and some differences. But when I transitioned from education to health, the big thing is adult learning is adult learning. The environments are the same. And it was really just the difference is really only the content. And I'm not a subject matter expert in the subjects. I'm just more of an instructional designer. I've learned how to develop content and e-learning. So that's part of the training that I had in addition to this kind of like being on the ground. And as part of my work, like I said, followed this holistic process because in certain cases, like assessing what the technology is, in terms of the context, there is not much electricity, not much internet. They're low resource environments. So really understanding that context to be able to assess the technology, looking at digital literacy skills, which obviously vary a great deal, competencies, reviewing different other competencies, and that's something that I'm also engaged in. Did professional development and, worked with the schools to integrate the technology. So when I came to Learning Engineer, I was like, kind of building upon the process that I was using anyway as a holistic project and bringing in all the people that we needed to do that. So like I said, have done this in many different countries, currently in transition. Part of the training that I'm trying to do right now is I didn't really have as much background in the learning analytics and the data science. So I'm doing a master's in learning analytics at the University of Texas in Arlington. So again, building upon my skill set and trying to learn more about that area.
So, Jodi, you just mentioned like some new training that you're getting right now. What are the different, can we just briefly focus on like what training expertise, like have you officially had that you brought in to learning engineering, like before you got here? What are those expertise areas?
Most of my training came from being on the ground. I lived in West Africa and the Gambia for 13 years. And that's actually when I started getting into educational technology. So a lot of it was on the job type of thing. Met with like lots of Peace Corps volunteers and other people who had a much better skill set than I. So really learned all the basics of even setting up a network. And doing, CCNA, the Cisco training, and other types of things, which I did many years ago, which of course is probably not at all applicable to the way things are done now. So lots of it was on the ground. And then I did a certificate in instructional design to learn more about e-learning and that type of thing. And then, like I said, I'm currently doing learning analytics to really build upon that skill set because I felt like that was the one skill that I really needed more to learn about.
Yeah, that's great. And I think it's also really important. I just want to kind of echo a couple of things that you said. Is
Yeah.
because that on-the-ground training is really important. And that makes for much more rich and impactful projects and solutions to problems. Um, so thank you. Yeah, thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah. I worked with one teacher in particular because he got computers pretty early on. And in the Gambia, there's actually a large tourist destination, and they all wanted to try to do good. So there was lots of computers that were donated to lots of different schools. And this particular school, they were one of the earlier ones. And so I worked with Mr. Raji until I left the Gambia for a long time. And so he would say I was his backbone, and I would always say that he was my teacher because, he really taught me how to, interact and how the schools really worked. And, we came together as a team, and then we set it up at his school and then visited many, many other schools and helped to train other teachers and set up computer programs at these other schools.
Okay, that's great. Now, one thing, you've actually already told us a lot about your learning engineering journey, like how you got here to learning engineering and what you've done in the background. But two other kind of follow-up questions that I have with that. Is there anything else that, you can think of, like what was important, like along the way for you? And as you're thinking about that, my other part that I'd really like to know is how did you find out about learning engineering? I'm always asking people that because I'm really interested to find those, find that out from people.
I agree too. That's probably the first question when I meet somebody who's shown up as part of the community call. I'm like, how did you learn about it? And I agree with that.
Yeah, it's just interesting because people learn from so many different ways. So,
Mm-hmm.
so the first question is talk about your journey.
Like many others, when I first heard the term learning engineering, I wasn't sure exactly what that meant. That I was invited to be on the IEEE Icicle steering committee when it was first being set up. And it was, obviously it was through the IEEE Learning Technology Standards Committee, and a couple of people got together on that. And one of the people that are on that team is Shelley Blake Plock. And I had known him for several years prior to this, working on other projects. We never were able to convince, though, my organization at the time to do the projects, but we had lots of conversations and we had lots of hope that we could do things with technology standards and other things. So he invited me to be part of the steering committee, and I ended up working a lot on the communications and now have been really actively involved in the Icicle community for 5 years now, and working on the competency framework. I'm a co-chair of that group. I'm always assisting with the conferences and doing and overseeing some of the communication. So definitely been actively involved. And so as I learned more about learning engineering, I was able to apply it to my work directly because so much of what was being spoken about and described as what is learning engineering, I was doing most of it anyway. So that's how I, got into learning engineering and was able to apply the different process. And learning engineering focuses a great deal on the instrumentation and the iterative process. And I think that's probably where I've learned the most from is that, because as I mentioned in the beginning, I'm working on my learning analytics and my skills and data. So just that's where I recognized I needed to learn more and wanted to start to implement that more in projects.
Yeah, and that's one thing I found as far as like data analytics and kind of that statistical type training. You can never have too much of it. More is always helpful, and it's also good to know that that we have Shelley to thank.
And Avron Bar. It was Abron who told Shelley about learning engineering, and then
Okay.
Shelley's like, "Let's do it," and the two of them got together and
Oh, that's
did
great. I did not know that. That's kind of neat.
and then with other people at the time, like Robbie Robson and other people who have been a great deal involved in the IEEE Standards Association and the Learning Technology Standards Committee.
Great. So you've already alluded to a lot of the projects that you've worked on, and you've done a lot of great projects. And now I'm going to ask you a hard question, which is, can you pick just one learning engineering project as an example?
One of the projects that I worked on was in Ghana. This was when I was working in the health sector, but it was all dealing with learning and training. And it was with midwifery and community nursing skills across the entire country. And they wanted to introduce e-learning to these skills. So really being aware of following the learning engineering process, understanding that context of what we were doing in the different schools, and different schools had different types of capacities. And then, looking at the learners and recognizing, their level of skills and things like that. So we obviously always started with the challenge. Would even technology be a solution in doing e-learning? And we learned that many of these schools already had a computer lab and they had an IT person. So we knew that we could at least start to introduce that. And we recognized that a lot of people were being interested in using digital learning. So in terms of the creation, again, looking toward the learning engineering process, we created a team. I mean, that's such a big part of learning engineering, is to have the team of people. So we had the subject matter experts, we had an instructional designer, we had the person who could set up Moodle on all of these different things. We had, what was going to be the support system. So all of these different parts of doing any kind of digital learning, and people realizing that it does take a village to be able to do this type of work. So we were able to work with a team to create the e-learning. They were really excited to learn about the whole process and about how to align the objectives to the activities, and then eventually to assessments, and what was more like quizzes at that time. And a person in Ghana was able to put it into one of the publishing software for e-learning and put that together, and then started distributing it to the different schools. It was interesting because some of the schools didn't really have very good internet. So the courses were just loaded locally on their computer, still using Moodle, but it was, just for that school. But as time went on, more schools were like, well, how can we get this online? And then we were looking toward, okay, how can you get all the, the basic data that you can get from a learning management system, go up to the Ministry of Health. So the Ministry of Health in their professional development department could be able to look at all of that. We found somebody, but it didn't ever work out, but we still thought that was a really great idea to be able to do that. And that's part of learning engineering, is trying to see what works and what doesn't work, and that whole iterative process. That was especially around the integration of the technology, because people didn't quite understand that, you can use it as an extra work, you can assign it, you could just take a piece of it, because there was lots of videos and case studies in it, and you could just use a case study in it. So again, lots of iteration in terms of that type of work. And for me, any of the interventions that I work on, that's what I do. And then people are like, oh, I want to do e-learning. And I'm like, do you know how much is involved in that?
And a lot of times that's just, part of our job is to educate people.
That's most of it.
How difficult that is.
It's very challenging.
And I was actually, I'm just fascinated with your story, because, trying to get the data going all the way up, it's tough. Yeah. That's one part about iterative design. You're doing it to see if it works, not because it's going to. You're evaluating what the process is and how well it works. And the fact that means you got people at least signed on to try.
Yeah, there was a great person at the Ministry of Health and his supervisor at the time, who were incredibly supportive of it. They had a hard time, though, as you said, educating the higher echelons in the ministry of the importance of it. And everything's about timing too, right? Are people ready to be able to use this and want to adapt it and put it into their environments? So that's the other thing, is many times I've worked on projects where we knew it was a good thing, but it was just too early. There's a project I worked on in Zambia, putting together what we call this global learning portal. And basically, one of these things that most schools and everybody has now in terms of creating a site for the ministry that the schools can access for materials. So putting up all kinds of different materials that were either available in country, but most was outside of the country, all the open educational resources. And a couple of years ago, I saw that the Ministry of Education had such a portal. So it's difficult in seeing where it is.
Oh, yeah. So, hey, Jodi, I just want to jump in to ask you a question about it because
Sure.
because you shared all of this project, this nursing skill development project that you did, and then I also mentioned your training and then the work you did previously. It's globally, and then in this low tech and low resources situation, as well as this project you just mentioned, and now you kind of back to like you kind of work out in this U.S. location, based location, this type of situation where it's like maybe high tech, will reach resources. I guess it's like question is like, what do you feel like this kind of like, other than this resources limitation and then the technology difference, what are the things that you think between these two type of situation, low tech versus high tech, and then how this learning engineering play a role into this type of thing? Based on the project like you did, it's not like you don't need to get it like a solution like how you should do that. It's not like the question like that big. I'm just curious because you have both experience in this.
It's like, yes, Jodi, you can just solve the problem here, and it'll be great. Um,
Yeah, that's failed every single time. When people come along and say, oh, I have the solution, and then it usually fails. And that's actually where the human-centered design part of learning engineering comes in, is what do people really need on the ground and what is the context? The value that I added to the work was introducing these more high-tech type things, or some kind of solution that they hadn't been aware of, and would it adapt to that context? So that's always usually my question to people is, can we talk about how to adapt it, if it's even possible? So, for example, I was talking to somebody who works for a data science company, and they have training that's online. And my first question to them was like, well, can we get it offline? Because it's really hard for people to get it online. And she's like, oh, well, we're working on that. And on that offline stuff, it's been super interesting following that over the years, especially for applications. So for example, Moodle's worked really hard on trying to create an offline to be able to access the courses. So they have an application that you could download onto your laptop, and then you download the courses and it works. They've worked really hard on their mobile app. So it's interesting seeing who's committed to working in these types of resources and environments, and how they're trying to do it. So it's more along the lines of what can work. And you would find, in any big city, like if you go to Nairobi or if you go to somewhere in Nigeria, there's pockets of people that are unbelievable and doing great work and have so much technology expertise at this point. And I've just seen that evolution over the last couple of decades, which is why I say, my role is to work myself out of a job, which I've done like 3 times now, because now there's people who can do that type of work. So that's a big part of what I do, and how to share with them what they don't know, because they don't know what they don't know.
Yeah, and that's so often the case. Okay, so you've already talked about some lessons that you've learned through the process, but I was wondering if you could talk about, so what lessons have you learned, like kind of over your career, either in the project you were just talking about or through other projects, that you'd like to share for future learning engineering teams?
Uh, the biggest lesson that I've learned through the years of my work, and especially now within the learning engineering, is the whole instrumentation process, is really thinking about, what do you want to know at the end of the learning? What are those learning outcomes? Because, I mean, in any education experience, the question is, well, what's our impact? And how do we show that the learning has taken place? And it is very difficult because a lot of times in my world, they were more focused on the technology. They didn't understand the technology was a tool. It's like, well, what's the impact of putting computers in the classroom type of thing? And I was always like, there's too many variables to figure that out. I'm like, is it a good teacher? Or is it a bad teacher? What happened? And I always said, if a good teacher is a good teacher with or without technology. So I have really learned more about that. I mean, as an instructional designer, when I first started out, it was always about aligning the activities with the learning objectives and then like the assessment with the learning objectives versus really thinking about the learner progress throughout the entire time that you're putting together these activities and these learning interventions. So I guess that's my biggest lesson, is starting off about what you want to know and building that data collection from the very beginning. So I think that's something a lot of us are trying to focus more and more on as more data is being available.
Yeah, and that is a very important task also that, again, a lot of people skip. And
Yeah.
and a lot of times they'll collect data because they can collect data.
Well, that's right, exactly. So I always had to work, part of the column monitoring and evaluation team, right? They wanted to know what the impact was. And they couldn't get it, in terms of trying to understand, the impact can go in many ways. A lot of schools, for example, they got technology. You had more kids actually showing up for school because the technology was there. Or a teacher who would have to take her calculator and, do her grading. And there wasn't enough calculators to go around the school, and they could go to Excel and do, sum it up and do that. So, I mean, it's the small things that actually have a very great impact. And then the other ones do evolve over time. But it was always challenging working with the team to have them understand it's not necessarily about the learning outcome, because there's too many variables, but really thinking through that whole process. And they were never involved in the beginning when we were designing the courses about what the assessments and stuff should be. We had people who were educators and subject matter experts who knew what they wanted to find out if the student learned it or not. So putting the quizzes and, the knowledge checks throughout was great, but it could have been improved. And that's what we're learning. It's all that iterative process of learning and growing.
So one more question for you. This is a fairly open question.
Mm-hmm.
We've talked a lot about your background. We've talked about a lot of, some of your projects you've worked on and lessons. But is there anything else that you'd like to kind of add or promote?
I've always wanted to try to make that bridge to my work and expand it in using learning engineering. And again, I think it's all about that timing thing when people are ready. I tried to talk to some people and some people got it, but they didn't really get it. So that's always been a challenge, to try to expand our learning engineering community to include more people internationally. And now we've had recently 2 Africans who've been showing up to our community calls. And I had a call with both of them this week to try to figure out how we can expand it and bring the learning engineering toolkit to Africa. So we want to work on like a project charter and start really thinking about it. So it can be very exciting, but again, 5 years ago, people weren't ready to be able to do that, or didn't know about learning engineering, and they were confused. So it was nice when people showed up to our community and be able to expand it with them.
Yeah. And that is really interesting. I've noticed that, I've seen a couple of people from Africa show up, and it's like, I wonder if can we expand it? Can we expand it even further?
Exactly. So we want to look at really look at the learning engineering toolkit and figure out how we can adapt it for the African context. Because once again, it comes back to context.
It does. And we might think about like, what barriers may be there too, because like it may also be language. Maybe what if we were able to take the toolkit and translate it and get it translated into different languages?
And that's a big issue in Africa because the first question people ask is it translated into French because there's so many francophone countries. And then there's 5 lusophone countries. There's 5 countries that speak Portuguese. So it's always, are these things going to be translated? Because like everywhere, it's mostly in English. But yeah, they were the Africans that showed up. One was from Nigeria and one was from Kenya. And they're both English countries, at least the official language in the country. I'm sure they speak many other local languages is my guess, but English is the national language, and they had a certain level of education. I mean, think about them, and what training or what people they interacted with to find out about learning engineering. That's, again, another really interesting story.
Yeah. So do you know of are there any initiatives now for promoting learning engineering within other countries? Or is that something we need to work on?
It's what we need to work on. So hopefully just trying to get the main ideas from Omotayo and from Lillian for Africa and setting up a project charter and then bringing in other people. What's really interesting is that through the Icicle, because it's part of IEEE, is that there's a lot of groups within IEEE that are trying to work in these low resource environments and low income countries. And we connected with one of them, been trying to figure out how to work with them. And then I know like there's this big digital literacy group, and then as part of Learning Technology Standard Committee, there is a whole digital literacy competency framework. So they have a competency framework that's been officially approved by the IEEE. So it can't just be us. I think it really should be this partnership with these different other groups. It's interesting. One of the persons has tried, but it didn't quite work out, and we all know that type of experience.
Yeah, it's unfortunate. But again, the fact that there's an attempt, because one attempt fails, that doesn't mean that future attempts will also fail.
Exactly. So yes, we'd like to start, building out this international community more, and bringing in some of the people who aren't as active as they once were, but are also very interested in the international side. So trying to create that as well.
Okay, great. Yeah, that's great. That's really exciting. Thank you for joining us today, Jodi. I don't know if any last things you'd like to add?
Just to welcome everybody to the learning engineering community, and we're love to be able to interact with you and work with you and learn from you all. So please join us.
Yes. Well, again, thank you for joining us today, Jodi, and I look forward to seeing you at the Icicle conference coming up.
Yeah, well, thank you all so much. It's such a pleasure to be able to share experiences and for people to learn from each other. So thank you for setting up this whole podcast experience for us to be able to expand and learn from the community.
Thank you. And thank you to our audience for joining us today.